This morning you already heard from Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 2 and verses 1 through 12, which tells the story of the wise men, the Magi. Literally, we get the word magician from Magi. You could translate it as I'm about to translate as I read those first two verses again. Hear these words. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, astrologers from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." I'll talk to you this morning about Stargazers and Kingmakers. March the 30th, 1981, just outside the Washington Hilton Hotel, John Hinckley attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan. He almost succeeded, for a bullet, or at least a part of a fragment of a bullet, deflected off of the presidential limousine and hit Reagan just under the arm in the side, penetrating into his lungs, very near his heart. Initially, they didn't realize he had been shot, but he went to the hospital and he fainted when he walked in the door, and they found the bullet wound and ultimately performed surgery, a very difficult and dangerous surgery, and preserved his life. In the aftermath of the attempted assassination on Ronald Reagan's life, his wife, Nancy, became so frightened about his future and how dangerous it was to be president that she had a conversation with an old friend, Merv Griffin. Merv suggested that she contact a psychic astrologer by the name of Joan Quisling. She did so, and for some time she consulted on a regular basis with this astrologer to try to find out when the most auspicious or inauspicious times for Reagan to travel. Now, I don't even know if she told Ronnie about this, but she did try to influence the chief of staff, because we found out about Nancy Reagan's consultation with an astrologer through a disenchanted Donald Regan, who was formerly a Treasury Secretary and then Chief of Staff of Ronald Reagan, that Nancy clashed with from time to time, and he outed her in a tell-all book. I share that story not to weigh in on that, other than to say that the use of people who claim to have some insight from studying the stars or the alignment of the planets. In the ancient world, they didn't understand planets. They thought the planets were stars. This is a long-standing idea. Some of you may still read your horoscope. I don't really believe in astrology or horoscopes, but I always find them entertaining because you can read a horoscope and find, well, just about anything you want to in them, if they're carefully written. This story of astrologers and people who study the stars to try to find some significance or importance for the life that we live in the world today goes back deep into human history, into time far before they understood the stars or why they were there or how far away they really are. In this story, the author of Matthew's Gospel, and I say the author of Matthew's Gospel because while tradition attributes this to Matthew, perhaps one of Jesus' disciples, in reality it was written by a second or third generation Christian who probably never met Jesus in person. He uses, and I presume it was a male, he uses Mark's Gospel as his base, but then he uses other sources to try to elaborate on the story and tell it differently than Mark. If you read Mark's Gospel, which we did over the past year as we moved through that Gospel in the times that I've been preaching and teaching, you'll notice that Mark doesn't have a birth story. John's Gospel doesn't have a birth story. Only two Gospels do. Luke, which we just finished up reading and associating with Christmas time and the Christmas story, and now Matthew, which introduces us to these strange individuals from the East called Magi, wise men, astrologers. No, they were not kings. That's a later, more medieval tradition, based on a text that I'll refer to later. But they weren't kings, and we're not told there were three of them. That's extrapolated from the idea that there were three gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We don't know much about them. We're not intended to. For you see, this story should not be read as literal history. What the author of this gospel is doing is he has been moving through the Old Testament scriptures, especially the book of Isaiah. And he's been looking for texts that he can apply to Jesus and tell the story and craft a narrative about Jesus that will be compelling to his fellow Jews. We still read it today. We tend to want to literalize it. The problem with literalizing it is you run into an immediate problem with trying to reconcile it to Luke's gospel. If you read Luke's gospel, his chronology is very tight. Jesus' parents, they live in Nazareth. They visit Bethlehem only for a brief time to fulfill the obligations of a census. Then, almost immediately, they go to Jerusalem where the offerings are made in behalf of a firstborn son in the temple. And then we're told they go right back to Nazareth, their home. That all takes place within roughly a two-month or less time period. But if you read Matthew's gospel, well, it's a very different story. Joseph and Mary have a home in Bethlehem. That's where they live. Jesus is born. In this story, the astrologers spot his star, and over a two-year period of time, we're told, they make their way first to Jerusalem and then to Bethlehem, and they find, because they've been geolocated by a star that strangely guides them and behaves in a way that, unlike any star that we know of, right? And they locate the house where Jesus is living. Still living after 2 years. If you try to reconcile that with Luke's gospel, you have a lot of problems there. We do it easily though, right? It's on the front. We bring them all together and make one story out of it. It's our story. It's a third story. So what do we do with this? What was this author trying to accomplish by telling this strange story of wise men, astrologers, coming to visit Jesus? I want to talk about that a little bit today. On the back of your bulletin, there's some thoughts that I'm going to share. I'll share them faster than I wrote them, I think. So follow quickly. First of all, Matthew writes to make the case that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. That is the Christ. It's the word we use. Because he fulfills the expectation of the Jewish scriptures. Now, what was he doing? Well, I'll tell you what he was doing. He was like an old country preacher. My grandfather, Frank Collins, my maternal grandfather, was a Free Will Baptist preacher. Now, in those days, in rural Alabama, you got the call. God called you to preach, right? We've all had some kind of experience of calling. He got the call, and in those days, he didn't go to school to get educated about the Bible. He received his King James version of it, and he read it. I still have his old Bible. It is tattered and torn because he not only read it, he would put it on the dashboard of his Ford pickup truck, and he would drive around with it up there, and the sun does horrible things to a leather cover of a Bible if you leave it there for so long. But his method of preaching was he would go to the Bible, and he would read till he found something that was very similar to what he already wanted to talk about. All preachers have probably done that from time to time. And so he used the text in that way. He used the Bible, not he was trying to read its historical and cultural context. He had no idea about, I don't even know if he realized the Bible was translated from Greek into English, and certainly not the King's English. But he used the Bible in that way, and he was very creative with it. I have a tape of one of his old sermons. Now, in those days, you weren't preaching unless you were yelling, all right? Yelling at people. He was a fire and brimstone preacher. But he used the Bible not in this kind of a literal technical sense as such, as he used it with great liberty, if you will. And he found things in there that if you go back and read it in its context, you would never find yourself. As you go through the Gospel of Mark, you will notice that this may very well be a Galilean country hill preacher. Because he goes to the Old Testament text of Isaiah, especially. He really loved Isaiah. You find it in chapter 1 where he finds the virgin birth story and applies it to Jesus from a text that really is not talking about a virgin birth story from Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14. But he used it in that way. It applied to Jesus. Here he uses one from Isaiah 60. Now, most people have not read Isaiah 60, and they don't read it in association with this text. But if you'll go back and read in your own time Isaiah 60, yes, it's in the Old Testament, you will find that chapter speaks of a time when there will be a great restoration of Jerusalem. It was written during the exile period when the Jews were out of the land and they were longing to return. But this writer that we call Isaiah spoke of a time when Jerusalem and Israel would be restored and its light would arise and it would draw people from the east, foreign dignitaries, and they would travel the journey and bring tribute to Israel. What kind of tribute? Hear the words from Isaiah 60. It says in Isaiah 60 verse 6, a multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah, and those from Sheba, which was in Arabia to the east, shall come, and they shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim the praise of Yahweh, of the Lord. That goes on from there. It talks about at the very beginning, arise, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Now that language was incorporated by the author of Matthew's Gospel. He read it. Now it's not referring specifically to a Messiah. It's not referring to a Messiah at all. But he used it in that way, and he used this story to create this story about the Magi, the astrologers from the east. And what kind of gifts do they bring? Well, gold and frankincense. Now they add myrrh because by the end of the chapter, by the end of the book, the Gospel of Matthew, myrrh was used associated with the death of someone in preparation of their body for the tomb. So what was the author of Matthew's Gospel doing? He was reading through the Old Testament, as we call it. He wouldn't call it the Old Testament at all. It was just the Hebrew Scriptures. And he wasn't even reading the Hebrew Scriptures, by the way. He was reading the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, which changes some of the wording. And he took that language and he began to tell stories. And he began to craft narratives. Narratives about some period of time in Jesus' life he probably didn't know much about, because the Gospel writers don't have a lot of knowledge about what took place with Jesus during his birth in the early years of his life. That's why Luke and Matthew are so different. They both believe he grew up in Nazareth. That was pretty well known. But they both also believed he was born in Bethlehem. They just couldn't agree on how it all happened. And if you read them both closely, you'll see that. But Matthew's Gospel is trying to use the Hebrew Scriptures to make a case that Jesus is the Messiah, and he used great creativity in doing so. Back when I was in seminary, I was in a biblical hermeneutics class. Hermeneutics is just a fancy word of saying interpretation of the Bible. And I did a study of all the so-called fulfillment text in the Gospel of Matthew, and I did it for the class. And one day I was in class and I asked the professor, this is a very conservative seminary, all right, very conservative Baptist theological seminary. And I raised my hand and I asked the professor, and I didn't ask the professor for anything. I said to Dr. Easley, Dr. Kendall Easley, I said, Dr. Easley, I studied all those fulfillment texts of the way Matthew used the Old Testament, and he would have failed this class because he pulled just about every one of them out of context. But in the ancient world, by and large, people couldn't read. If you heard a text or you encountered a text, it was because someone read it to you. So they didn't have Bibles they would go back and collect. They didn't care so much about that. What they cared about was making a powerful case that the person that they had come to love and trust and believe in, Jesus of Nazareth, was indeed the Christ, the Messiah. And that's the way he uses this text, these ancient texts, in this story about the astrologers. But there's more. Matthew writes to make the case that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah who would bring Jews and Gentiles into the kingdom of God. It's important to notice the characters here. These magi, these astrologers from the east, make the journey following a star, they say, which is really the way it's put from Isaiah, your light shining, arising in the east. And they get there, and first of all, they go to the Jews, King Herod, who's important, and I'll touch on him later. But they go to King Herod. So they tell the Jews in Jerusalem, hey, the Christ has been born. The Messiah has been born. A king of the Jews has been born, and we've seen his star in the east. And so the Jews have received an epiphany, if you will. That's the idea of epiphany, the manifestation, the revealing that the Christ has arrived, the Christ child has been born. And these are Gentiles who are doing it. Now, what's interesting about this story, and ironic the way Matthew tells it, is the people who should be most aware of what's going on are the least aware. It's the Gentiles who get the information. Kind of like in Matthew's version of it, the shepherds the people who seem to be, what you would presume to be the most preoccupied with other things, get the visitation from the heavenly angels. It's the way of turning the story upside down that the gospel writers often did. And here you have Gentiles informing the Jews that their Messiah has been born, but the point of this is a theme throughout the entire Gospel of Matthew, is the idea that Christ intends to bring Jew and Gentile alike together. So that by the end of the Gospel of Matthew, you have Jesus in his post-resurrection appearance to his disciples telling them to go and do what? Make disciples of all nations. The word nations, all ethnicities, the Gentiles. So what the author is trying to do is say Jesus is not simply a Jewish Messiah. Jesus is for everyone. The message and mission of Jesus is all-inclusive. It's not intended to divide people and tear people apart. That's an important word, by the way. Because the way that Christians have historically read texts like Matthew, they read them and they have not only said horrible things about the Jews, they've sometimes persecuted them while quoting texts from Matthew. How could they not believe? How could they not read the Old Testament scriptures as creatively as our preachers did? And so the text that was intended to emphasize how God wants to be all-inclusive and help us rise beyond our religious tribalism has often been used to promote that very religious tribalism. That's why we look at the Abrahamic faiths today, and we look at the sad history of Jews persecuting the early followers of Jesus, and then the later followers of Jesus returning the favor. And now Coptic Christians in Egypt have to worry about a third Abrahamic faith that is literally trying to kill them in many cases, the Muslims, the Muslim extremists in Egypt and other parts of the world. A message that was intended to bring people together and help us rise beyond our localism and our tribalism is often used to tear one another apart. No, one of the reasons Matthew writes this story in the way he does is to send out the message that we have to rise above this notion that we alone have the truth. That's a very important word today. We live in the 21st century. We just simply can't afford to have another century where religion drives wedges between people and tries to tear one another apart. We need to try to promote better understanding. We may not agree. We won't agree. We have different perspectives. We come from different backgrounds. That's okay. I'm not at war with my Muslim friends or my Jewish friends or my irreligious friends, the people who have no faith in God. I'm not at war with them. We all have different understandings. We all have different experiences. I have mine. I'll share it with you. I'll listen to yours. But let's move beyond as we begin this new year, this temptation to want to believe that we know everything that can be known about God, and then being more willing to persecute and punish those who have a different perspective. I think that's part of the message of this text. And I think that's what Matthew wanted to convey, though it was often misused throughout history. And then there's one final thing I think we can see here. Matthew writes to make the case that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah who embodies all the qualities human beings long for in those who lead them. It's not an accident that the author introduces us to an individual who is called Herod the Great. Now, it's confusing when you read about Herods in the Bible. They seem to be all over the place and they never go away. Because this is Herod the Great. He lived he reigned and lived from a period of time about 37 BCE all the way to 4 BCE. That was his time of reign as a king. He was a client king of Rome. He was half Jewish, half Edomite. If you know anything about that, that's okay. But the Romans chose him because, well, he seemed to be promising, and he ruled in Judea for that period of time, over 30 years. He also expanded and built upon the temple complex to where the temple of Herod the Great had become recognized as what we would call one of the wonders of the world. He built it because he loved God? No, he loved Herod. And he wanted to leave his name on some great structure that would outlast him. Right? Human beings have not changed. They still want to build great structures and monuments to themselves. So Herod the Great was not, well, he was effective, and the Romans tolerated him because he was effective at doing what they needed. He was securing an area of the world that was, well, it was a buffer between them and the Parthian Empire. Interestingly enough, the wise men, the astrologers, were probably been from the Parthian Empire. But King Herod was ruthless. He was brutal. It was said that Octavian mentioned at one time, this may be anecdotal and hard to prove, that it was more dangerous to be Herod's son than it was to be Herod's pig. Because Herod wouldn't even brook any rivals within his own family. He was ruthless. We read the story where we're told that at the end of this story where he slaughters the children 2 years and younger. There's no historical evidence that literally happened, but it certainly fits Herod's character in the story. But Herod the Great in this story is portrayed as a powerful man who is ruthless and brutal, who looks out for himself, a tyrant. But in this story is introduced the true king of the Jews, the king who fulfills the longing of the people. The text from the Old Testament once again is used to say Bethlehem will be the place when God will raise up a ruler who will shepherd my people. It borrows heavily from language from Psalm 72, which we studied today in the Bible study period. In Psalm 72, there's a longing. It was a coronation psalm. It was a song set to poetry, probably set to music, that the people chanted with the arrival of a new king. The early Christian followers of Jesus read this psalm and saw Jesus in it. And in that psalm, it talks about the longing for a day when there would be a king who would judge and rule in righteousness, who would be concerned about a broadly shared prosperity, not just concentrating wealth with the most powerful, but would be concerned for all the people, would be a defender of the oppressed, would especially be concerned about the poor. Jesus fits that image, according to Matthew. Jesus, in contrast to Herod the Great, is the true king who comes to lead as a shepherd, not to empower himself and build great monuments to himself, but to meet the people where they are, especially the poor, especially the oppressed, and empower them. That is the difference between true leadership and false leadership. False leadership is self-absorbed, self-obsessed, and interested in empowering oneself and being remembered as great. But the kind of leadership that Jesus embodies and the kind of leadership that Matthew wants to emphasize here is the kind of leadership that is like a shepherd. A leadership that wants to produce or see produced in their realm broad prosperity and to empower people who are poor and oppressed and marginalized, and to lift them up, to bring them into the circle, to offer a completely different vision. That was what was in vogue at the time. Now, I read these texts today, and I see messages still for us. No, we don't have a king. We're Americans. We got rid of our king some time ago. We have a separation of powers. So we live in a very different world in the 21st century. But we still live in a world, at least we still should live in a world, where we recognize and we reward those who lead from a position of servant leadership, who want to empower others, who want to lift them up, who want to defend the poor, look out for the oppressed. And remember that greatness is not found in being a tyrant or an authoritarian, but being able to use what power you're granted by the people to bring about a broadly shared prosperity that especially looks out for the poor and defends those who are oppressed and hurting. That is really what the message that Matthew is trying to convey, not only in these opening chapters, but throughout the entire gospel. And here we are at the beginning of 2019. Think about it. We're here almost 2,000 years after the time of Jesus. And we still long to live in the kind of realm, if you will, the kind of society where there's broadly shared prosperity, where there's a deep concern for those who are hurting. There's a desire to bring those who are marginalized inside the circle and not put them out, and to work to empower people. We're not looking for a king, but we all can work together to bring about whatever we have. I talked about this in the Bible study class at the end. In America, we're all kings and queens because we're the people. So we get this kind of society that we want. Do we want one where people are brought together who rise above the tribalism of religion and other differences? Do we want to have a society where there's broadly shared prosperity, where people who are hurting and suffering are brought or are enabled to come out of that into a better life? Are we willing to try to work together to especially defend those who are oppressed and poor and hurting, to make sure they have a voice? I hope so. And if we hear that and we live out that message and we follow it in our lives, we'll truly embody what this story about three wise men are all about. So that in the 21st century world, we wise men and wise women will continue to seek that kind of society to live in.